A lot of development organizations these days are really challenged by getting features out on time, on a given schedule, and at the same time keeping the quality up. And one of the key challenges is very often that when the QA process is separated from a development process, QA becomes an afterthought. Then at the end of, before the release is due, everybody's trying to get everything in at the same time. I'm a big believer, and a lot of people are, and that's one of the mantras actually of Agile. You should really test your code as you develop that, meaning interleaving development very tightly with testing. 2 years ago, we had a traditional QA-based development process where we had a QA team that was in Eastern Europe, was outsourced, and the QA process started 6 weeks before the release was due in the traditional 3 phases: feature freeze, integration freeze, and release freeze. Because the QA was kind of an afterthought of development, when we entered the release hardening cycle, we didn't really know where we were in terms of quality and in terms of the number of bugs we find and the severity of the bugs. So as a result, we felt very anxious every time we entered in a release cycle. Are we going to land the release in the quality that we expected for our product? So one of the challenges we had with having the QA organization outsourced to Eastern Europe was, number one, there was a 10-hour difference. Number two, it was an outside organization, meaning we were not totally in control of the resources. So we were not in control of the hiring process. We were not in control of the people we actually received. And they were not directly reporting to us. So that compounded to a whole number of challenges. Number one is time difference is always different. 10 hours is kind of almost the opposite of the cycle that you can work. Meaning, when we had an issue on one day, we had to wait at least another day till the issue could get resolved. Number two, there are cultural differences. It's just, I mean, you know, in Eastern Europe, things are done differently the way we introduced that. And these differences were not always easy. Language barriers and so on, right? But the biggest difficulty was really that the traditional QA team, the skills are really focused on testing and testing only. They're very, very good on this, but they're not very good in, for example, automating testing, which we aim to do. So one of the key problems we really faced with that process and the team being in Eastern Europe was that the QA process was separate from the development process. First of all, team-wise, but also in terms of the process itself. We did development first, and then we did the QA process. So one of the first goals we really had is we need to mix the development and interleave it with the QA process. So we started with a reorganization and took essentially that team in Eastern Europe, and 2/3 of these people we moved into development teams. So this reorganization didn't really work out. Number one, it did really not solve the difference of time. So we still had a 10-hour time difference with all the communication bottlenecks. But most importantly, the skills were just not matched to what we were aiming to do. We were aiming to automate all the testing, and the team in Eastern Europe was just not experienced in that. So for that reason, this really didn't work out. So it was very clear for us that the outsourcing of the testing process into Eastern Europe doesn't really work. So what we did is we moved these resources over 1 year from Eastern Europe to Calgary in Canada. Calgary in Canada, we had already a little office with 3 developers. That's 2.5 hours flight away from San Francisco, is 1 hour time difference. It was just much easier in terms of a distributed development to have that team so close by, you know, very close time zone. So communication was much, much easier. Right? So we not only moved the skills one-to-one to Calgary, also changed the skill sets. So we actually focused on developers who can program in Java and essentially take an active role to automate all the testing by writing them essentially in Java. Yeah, so with that change, when we made the change to Calgary, one of the key aspects we were pushing very hard was automating the entire test process, you know, whether it's in a Coverity Connect component or the end-to-end test. And we had the mantra of test automation, and I talked about test automation and test automation and test automation and test automation to the team. I'm sure they cannot hear me anymore about that, but it was one of the critical elements which I very strongly believe in, to get essentially code development and testing interleaved to make the entire process more predictable, as well as getting the quality of the product up. So the interesting side effect actually of moving the QA resources into development is that developers actually always felt responsible for the quality of the product. But the artificial separation between development and QA kind of made this a side effect, or made this something that, as it appears, not to be important. And that's why, you develop all the features, then you give it to someone else to test, and that someone else is responsible for finding your bugs. By moving these two organizations together, you really get to the heart of it by essentially, finding the bugs right at the time when you develop the features. To give you an example, the progress we made in the end-to-end testing process. 2 years ago, we had about 300 tests that were all executed manually. Today, we have 3,500 tests. 97% of them are executed automatically on our test farm. So as a result of that, today, when we cut a minor release, it's a maintenance release between major releases. It used to take us 2 weeks to go through the entire hardening cycle for this minor release. We can do this now in 3 days, or maybe even less in the future. That's a dramatic improvement by which we can crank out maintenance releases in a rapid progress. As one of the results of our efforts in test automation, the number of founds that were actually found by customers, or customer found defects, reduced significantly over the last 2 years. After initial spike, after the first release, we actually reduced now the number of customer found defects by 30%. And we expect that this continues, that trend, as we increase the test automation forward going.